I think there's only one candidate in the race who can prevent the Chinese from invading Taiwan, and that is Lai Ching-te.
新闻硬邦邦，听新闻最爽。我是节目主持人斯坦，欢迎各位收看。今天我在牛嘴溪这边，就是有美东的信赖台湾后援会，我们要支持台湾。挺赖清德，然后我今天在这里遇到了一位特别来宾 Gordon, thank you so much for agreeing to take part in this show. It's a pleasure, and I've been a long fan of yours, and I really do appreciate that you came here.
Well, I very much appreciate the interview, so thank you.
Thank you. Gordon, so here the whole event, it's focused on the figure of a presidential candidate, Lai Ching-te. And many people right now in Taiwan are discussing who is the most suitable person for the position of the president of Taiwan. And what is your opinion on that topic?
I think there's only one candidate in the race who can prevent the Chinese from invading Taiwan, and that is Lai Ching-te.
Yeah.
And the reason is because he believes in strength. He believes in making sure that Taiwan can't be invaded. The others are just trying to appease China, and small appeasing the large never works.
I think, like during your speech, you said one very important thing. If there has been more support to Ukraine before the war, Putin might have not invaded, right?
If Ukraine, for instance, were a NATO member,
yeah.
Putin would not have invaded. If the United States and other countries had supplied Ukraine with munitions beforehand, Russia probably wouldn't have invaded. So it was the weakness that was provocative. And that's really going to be Taiwan's problem. If China believes that it can take over Taiwan, it will invade. If they believe that they can't get away with it, they won't. It's very simple. Bullies, anybody who's been in a sandbox with a bully in elementary school should understand this.
Yeah, and actually Putin and Xi Jinping, they have many similarities and they do cooperate with each other. You see those military drills that they do together. And actually during the Russia's invasion in Ukraine, many people in Taiwan started discussing the topic. If Ukraine is now, maybe we will be the next.
That's an obvious connection. And even the people in Japan said the same thing. Japan decided to radically increase its defense spending because of the Ukraine invasion.
Yeah, and right now, actually, many people are asking the question, how can you deter the aggression coming from, for example, Russia in Europe or from China in Indo-Pacific region?
The only way is to make it clear that the cost of invading would be unacceptable. In Taiwan's case, they've got to make it clear that they can repel an invasion of Taiwan. And also with Taiwan's case, if they can show that they've got friends who will be on its side, then clearly that is going to be something that will, I think, very much deter China.
And talking about the cognitive warfare from Russia to Ukraine or from China to Taiwan, right now you can see a lot of misinformation and disinformation campaigns being conducted against Taiwan, and there are more and more channels that are supporting China, supporting the appeasement towards China are actually being opened up in Taiwan. Do you have any suggestions? How can we differentiate between the true information and the false information?
That's important because China is ramping up its political warfare against Taiwan. We saw that, for instance, with those stories circulating that Tsai Ing-wen had an escape plan and was going to leave at the first moment of an invasion. Zelensky was able to rally Ukraine because he would not leave. The United States even offered to extract him. He said,
he didn't need a ride.
He said, I'm staying.
Yeah.
So, those stories that China put out, which were false, they're very clear that they wanted to dishearten the people in Taiwan.
But how do you think, because there are many, for example, elderly people in Taiwan who receive such an information. For example, recently there has been a campaign when they got those information on online messaging apps. If Taiwan gets unified with China, then all of your bank savings will be exchanged from new Taiwan dollars to the Chinese currency, and the currency exchange rate would be like 1-to-1. And some people believed in that. So I wanted to ask you, how do you differentiate it? How do you find which information is true and which is false?
Yeah. Taiwan's got a really difficult problem because it's being inundated.
Yeah.
And one way is to cut off, obviously, Chinese outlets. But the other thing to do is just to just rebut it as it occurs. And you have to continue to do that, because one of China's media strategies is it puts out stuff which is obviously false, but it believes that if it continues to do it, that repetition is going to make it credible. So you have to rebut it when it happens, and you have to continue to rebut it. And of course, you have to make sure that media outlets are not owned by parties that are friendly to China. That's a difficult thing in a democracy to do, but nonetheless, when you can show that China's been using these media outlets for disinformation to try to undermine freedom and democracy in Taiwan, you just have to say, no, you can't own it anymore. That's a very difficult thing, but remember, Taiwan's in an emergency situation. So I think that they need to take measures which would otherwise be considered drastic.
Thank you so much. During your speech, you also mentioned fentanyl problem and synthetic drugs coming to the United States from China. Actually, in Taiwan, more than 60% of all the drugs, illegal drugs, they come from China. And do you think that there is some room for cooperation between the United States and Taiwan on fighting like the illegal synthetic drugs coming into these countries?
Yeah. What needs to be done is for the United States to make a determination that it's not just some sort of criminal gang in China, that it's the Communist Party, and to sanction the Communist Party and impose costs that are greater than the benefits Beijing believes it receives by sending fentanyl into the U.S., which means cutting trade, cutting investment, cutting technical cooperation, just make it so punishing that China will not continue to do this. But China's behind this. I mean, China runs a near total surveillance state. 700 million surveillance cameras. 1.69 billion cell phones are used to locate people. And they've got other ways to do it. So China knows what these fentanyl gangs are doing, and that means that the Communist Party approves of the selling of drugs. And you know, Taiwan and the United States and any other country that has, you know, the recipient of Chinese fentanyl, they should impose those costs.
I do agree with you here, and actually if we look at those pharmaceutical companies or chemical manufacturers that are involved in producing those drugs, they all have CCP members inside. It's like by law, if a company is big, you have to have a CCP observer there. And one last question I wanted to ask you is about current attitude of the United States towards Taiwan, because people-to-people communication, it's very friendly. Many people are very welcoming and they think that they should help and support Taiwan. But if we look at the position of the White House, the so-called strategic ambiguity, sometimes, like for example during the recent visit of Secretary of State Blinken or Secretary of Treasury Yellen, I've heard Mr. Blinken saying that the United States doesn't support Taiwan's independence. I know that also it goes in the line with those strategic ambiguity positions, but don't you think that it sends wrong signals to the Chinese Communist Party?
It certainly sends the wrong signal. During that trip of Secretary Blinken to Beijing, they humiliated him from the get-go. And so he shouldn't have said anything, even if it was consistent with American policy. He should not have said anything that Beijing wanted to hear. He just needed to show the Chinese that he was not intimidated by them. But unfortunately, he said, yeah, we do not support Taiwan independence. That was not the right thing to say. America's one China policy is basically, we recognize Beijing as a legitimate government of China. We acknowledge, in the sense that we say we understand that's what they say, but don't approve, their position that China includes Taiwan. And we say the situation of Taiwan is unresolved and has to be resolved with the consent of the people in Taiwan. Now, saying that we don't support Taiwan independence is technically consistent with that policy. But as I said, we should not have said anything that Beijing wanted to hear, especially after the way they treated Blinken.
Yeah, because if you're ambiguous, then be ambiguous. Saying that you just don't support the Taiwan's independence is a little bit, it goes in a little bit of different direction from ambiguity. And the last thing is, there are many Taiwanese Americans here today. How do you think the diaspora members, the Taiwanese diaspora, can help with Taiwanese democratization processes, with elections, and what can they do, for example, with fighting the cognitive warfare.
Yeah. Taiwanese in the United States, they should talk to their representative, they should talk to their senator, talk to their governor. China's propaganda and political warfare is directed at all levels of American society. So Taiwanese should direct their efforts at all levels of American society and show that the Chinese propaganda is wrong. That means being as active as China is. That's going to be difficult for a smaller country, but it's absolutely essential because Taiwan is facing an existential crisis.
Thank you so much, Gordon. And one last thing, I brought your book. Could you please sign it for me?
Now is the time to defend freedom and democracy in Taiwan.
Thank you, Gordon, for agreeing to take part in this interview. 如果大家支持台湾，一定要这一次好好的回家投票。那我是斯坦，我们下次见，再会啦。